Okay. Welcome. 28 January. Welcome to Dis and Dat, the autonomous collective.net. Um, as I was yammering about yesterday in our last episode, the uh, the Steve Keen article that I asserted that this 1993 Steve Keen article lays out the differences among the two sort of diverging ideas about the labor theory of value. And it perhaps it seems far too simple, but it is, I think, a fairly clear to see that it is about transcending rather than displacing the labor theory of value. On the other hand, because time marches on, certain other ideas are important at the same time, and that signify this transcending the labor theory of value. And another example of that is space and time. And David Harvey does a lecture on the space and time of value, which I think is actually fairly important relative to David Harvey's work. But once I started going down that path, I found far too many other things to yak about. Um, so without showing, I included the video of that about the space and time of value, because it's actually a fairly important element, I think, of understanding David Harvey's work, but also that space and time are operative in the examples I was giving the other day about the differences uh, of among certain types of capital comparisons. That is, constant capital versus variable capital, and fixed capital versus circulating capital. And that they do represent different moments, perhaps, in Marx's understanding of or development of certain ideas about capital, the key element of which is space and time. That is, that in the difference between constant and variable capital, it's about labor. And in fixed capital versus circulating capital, it's a little bit more about, cycles and time. And this difference, however subtle, is actually kind of important. So I went down a rabbit hole about certain articles. So there's this one set of articles that I'm not going to deal with now because it's just too long. I may deal with it tomorrow. Um, but to get there, how I got there was via Lenin talking about uh, space and time. Um, Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism is a book wherein Lenin is dealing more specifically with scientific issues, following on Engels. So it is. It may seem like a dead end for some people, but I actually think it's an important idea. The difference between a kind of idealism, or the difference between idealism and materialism, and Lenin is, tries to really deal with this. Following on, I think all of the issues brought up that Engels brings up about science, Marxism as a science. And so how we get there, how we get to space and time issues is via, a somewhat circuitous route. But let me just introduce what Lenin does in this one passage on space and time, which sounds a little out there on the one hand. On the other hand, Lenin is making a point, and this is in terms of Mach's work, Mach's philosophy, and and it's a kind of internal argument about the questions related to the difference between reason and faith, and or religion and idealism versus materialism. And I hope in reading this that that will become somewhat clear on the one hand, and provide a means by which we can talk further about um, how Marx's issues of space and time are important to understand what the value things we were talking about yesterday. So let me start. Recognizing the existence of objective reality, that is, i.e., matter in motion, independently of our mind, materialism must also inevitably recognize the objective reality of time and space. In contrast, above all, to Kantianism, which is in this question sides with idealism and regards time and space not as objective realities, but as forms of human understanding. The basic difference between the two fundamental philosophical lines on this question is also quite clearly recognized by writers of the most diverse trends who are in any way consistent thinkers. Let's begin with the materialist. Space and time, says Feuerbach, are not mere forms of phenomena, but essential conditions of being. Regarding the sensible world we know through sensations as subjective reality, Feuerbach naturally also rejects the phenomenalist, as Mach would call his own conception, or the agnostic, as Engels calls it, conception of space and time. Just as things or bodies are not mere phenomena, not complexes of sensation, but objective realities acting on our senses, so space and time are not mere forms of phenomena, but objectively real forms of being. There is nothing in the world but matter in motion, and matter in motion cannot move otherwise than in space and time. This is the fundamental point. That is why I'm fussing with this. Human conceptions of space and time are relative, but these relative conceptions go to compound absolute truth. These relative conceptions in their development move towards absolute truth and approach nearer and nearer to it. The mutability of human conceptions of space and time no more refutes the objective reality of space and time than the mutability of scientific knowledge of the structure and forms of matter in motion refutes the objective reality of the external world. Engels, exposing the inconsistent and muddled materialist Dühring, this is the reference here is, the stuff written Engels and anti-Dühring, catches him on the very point where he speaks of the change in the idea of time, a question beyond controversy for contemporary philosophers of any importance, even in the most diverse philosophical trends, but evades a direct answer to the question, are space and time real or ideal, and are our relative conceptions of space and time approximations to objectively real forms of being? Are they only products of the developing, organizing, harmonizing, etc. human mind? This and this alone is the basic epistemological problem on which the truly fundamental philosophical trends are divided. Engels in anti-Dühring says, quote, "We're not here in the least concerned with what ideas change in Herr Dühring's head. The subject at issue is not an idea of time, but real time, which Herr Dühring cannot rid himself of so cheaply, i.e., by the use of such phrases as the mutability of our conceptions." Now, this would seem so clear that even the Yukeviches should be able to grasp the essence of the matter. Engels sets up against Dühring the proposition of the reality, i.e., objective reality of time, which is generally accepted by and obvious to every materialist, and says that one cannot escape a direct affirmation or denial of this proposition merely by talking of the change in the ideas of time and space. The point is not that Engels denies the necessity and scientific value of investigations into the change and development of our ideas of time and space, but that we should give a consistent answer to the epistemological question vis-a-vis the question of the source and significance of human knowledge in general. Any moderately intelligent philosophical idealist, and Engels, when he speaks of idealists, has in mind the great consistent idealists of classical philosophy, will readily admit the development of our ideas of time and space. He would not cease to be an idealist for thinking, for example, that our developing ideas of time and space are approaching towards the absolute idea of time and space, and so forth. It is impossible to hold consistently to a standpoint in philosophy which is inimical to all forms of fideism and idealism. If we do, fideism is the holding to the separation or difference between faith and reason. And idealism, if we do not definitely and resolutely recognize that our developing notions of time and space reflect an objectively real time and space, and that here too, as in general, they are approaching objective truth. Let me break here for a second and note that Lenin does believe in a somewhat mechanical, well, I don't know, he wouldn't refer to it as mechanical, but a kind of reflection theory of perception. But anyway, the basic forms of all being, Engels admonishes during, are space and time, and existence out of time is just as gross an absurdity as existence out of space. Excuse me. Why was it necessary for Engels in the first half of the quotation to repeat Feuerbach almost literally, and in the second to recall the struggle which Feuerbach fought so successfully against the gross absurdities of theism? Because Düring, as one sees from the same chapter of Engels, could not get the ends of his philosophy to meet without resorting now to the final cause of the world, now to the initial impulse, which is another expression for the concept God, Engels says. Düring, no doubt, wanted to be a materialist and atheist no less sincerely than our Machians want to be Marxists. But he was unable consistently to develop the philosophical point of view that would really cut the ground from under the idealist and theist absurdity. Since he did not recognize, or at least did not recognize clearly and distinctly, for he wavered and was muddled on this question, the objective reality of time and space, it was not accidental but inevitable that Düring should slide down an inclined plane to final causes and initial impulses, for he had deprived himself of the objective criterion which prevents one going beyond the bounds of time and space. If time and space are only concepts, man, who created them, is justified in going beyond their bounds, and bourgeois professors are justified in receiving salaries from reactionary governments for defending the right to go beyond these bounds, for directly or indirectly defending medieval absurdity. Engels pointed out to Düring that denial of the objective reality of time and space is theoretically philosophical confusion, while practically it's capitulation to, or impotence in face of, fideism. Behold now the teachings of recent positivism on this subject. We read in Mach, space and time are well-ordered systems of series of sensations. Now, this is palpable idealist nonsense, such as inevitably follows from the doctrine that bodies are complexes of sensations. According to Mach, it's not man with his sensations that exists in space and time, but space and time that exist in man, that depend upon man and are generated by man. He feels that he's falling into idealism and resists by making a host of reservations. And like Düring, burying the question under lengthy disquisitions, see especially Knowledge and Error, on the mutability of our conception of space and time, their relativity, and so forth. But this does not save him and cannot save him, for one can really overcome the idealist position on this question only by recognizing the objective reality of space and time. And this Mach will not do at any price. He constructs his epistemological theory of time and space on the principle of relativism, and that is all. In the very nature of things, such as a construction can lead to nothing but subjective idealism, as we have already made clear when speaking of absolute and relative truth. Resisting the idealist conclusions which inevitably follow from his premises, Mach argues against Kant and insists that our notion of space is derived from experience. But if objective reality is not given us an experience, as Mach teaches, such an objection to Kant does not in the least destroy the general position of agnosticism in the case either of Kant or of Mach. If our notion of space is taken from experience, without being a reflection of objective reality outside us, Mach's theory remains idealistic. The experience of nature in time, measured in millions of years prior to the appearance of man and human experience, shows how absurd this idealist theory is. In the physiological respect, writes Mach, time and space are systems of sensation of orientation, which together with sense perceptions determine the discharge of biologically purposive reactions of adaptation. In the physical respect, time and space are interdependencies of physical elements. The relativist Mach confines himself to an examination of the concept of time in its various aspects. And like Düring, he gets nowhere. If elements are sensations, then the dependence of physical elements upon each other cannot exist outside of man. It could not have existed prior to man and prior to organic matter. If the sensations of time and space can give man a biological purposive orientation, that can only be so in the condition that these sensations reflect an objective reality outside man. Man could never have adapted himself biologically to the environment if his sensations had not given him an objectively correct presentation of the environment. The theory of space and time is inseparably connected with the answer to the fundamental question of epistemology. Are our sensations images of bodies and things, or are bodies complexes of our sensations? Mach merely blunders about between the two answers. In modern physics, he says, Newton's idea of absolute time and space prevails, of space and time as such. This idea seems to us senseless, Mach continues, apparently not suspecting the existence of materialists and of a materialist theory of knowledge. But in practice, he claims, this view was harmless and therefore for a long time escaped criticism. This naive remark regarding the harmlessness of the materialist view betrays Mach completely. Firstly, it's not true that for a long time the idealists did not criticize this view. Mach simply ignores the struggle between the idealist and materialist theories of knowledge on this question. He evades giving a plain and direct statement of these two views. Secondly, by recognizing the harmlessness of the materialist views he contests, Mach thereby, in fact, admits their correctness. For if they were incorrect, how could they have remained harmless through the course of centuries? What has become of the criterion of practice with which Mach attempted to flirt? The materialist view of the objective reality of time and space can be harmless only because natural science does not transcend the bounds of time and space. The bounds of the material world, leaving this occupation to the professors of reactionary philosophy. Such harmlessness is equivalent to correctness, as in political correctness. It is Mach's idealist view of time, of space and time, that is harmful. For, in the first place, it opens the door wide for fideism, and in the second place, seduces Mach himself into drawing reactionary conclusions. For instance, in 1872, Mach wrote that one does not have to conceive of the chemical elements in a space of 3 dimensions. To do so would be to impose an unnecessary restriction upon ourselves. There is no more necessity to think of what is mere thought spatially, that is to say, in relation to the visible and tangible, than there is to think of it in a definite pitch. The reason why a satisfactory theory of electricity has not been yet established is perhaps because we have insisted on explaining electrical phenomena in terms of molecular processes in a 3-dimensional space. From the standpoint of the straightforward and unmuddled Marxism, which Mach openly advocated in 1872, it is indisputable that if molecules, atoms, in a word, chemical elements, cannot be perceived, they are mere thought. If so, if space and time have no objective reality, it is obvious that it is not essential to think of atoms spatially. Let physics and chemistry restrict themselves to a three-dimensional space in which matter moves. For the explanation of electricity, however, we may seek its elements in a space which is not three-dimensional. That our Machians should circumspectly avoid all reference to this absurdity of Mach's, although he repeats it in 1906, is understandable, for otherwise it would have to raise the question of the idealist and materialist views of space point blank, without evasions, and without attempting to reconcile these antagonistic positions. It is likewise understandable that in the 70s, when Mach was still entirely unknown and when orthodox physicists even refused to publish his articles, one of the chiefs of the uh, eminentist school, Anton Voluntarily should eagerly have seized upon precisely this argument of Mach's as a noteworthy renunciation of materialism and recognition of idealism. For at that time, Leclerc had not yet invented, or not yet borrowed from Schupp and Schubert Soldern or Remke the new sobriquet of immanentist school, but plainly call himself a critical idealist. This unequivocal advocate of fideism, who openly preached it in his philosophical works, immediately proclaimed Mach a great philosopher because of these statements, a revolutionary in the best sense of the word, and he was absolutely right. Mach's argument amounts to deserting science for fideism. Science was seeking, both in 1872 and in 1906, it is now seeking and is discovering, at least it's groping its way towards the atom of electricity, the electron in three-dimensional space. Science does not doubt that the substance it is investigating exists in three-dimensional space, and hence that the particles of that substance, although they be so small that we can't see them, must also necessarily exist in this three-dimensional space. Since 1872, during the course of 3 decades of stupendous and dazzling scientific successes in the problem of the structure of matter, the materialist view of space and time has remained harmless, i.e., compatible as heretofore with science, while the contrary view of Mach and company was a harmful capitulation to the position of fideism. In his text, Mechanic, Mach defends the mathematicians who are investigating the problem of conceivable spaces with n dimensions. He defends them against the charge of drawing preposterous conclusions from their investigations. The defense is absolutely and undoubtedly just, but see the epistemological position that Mach takes up in this defense. Recent mathematics, Mach says, has raised the very important and useful question of a space of n dimensions as a conceivable space. Nevertheless, the three-dimensional space remains the only real case. In vain, therefore, have many theologians who experience difficulty in deciding where to place hell, as well as the spiritualists, sought to derive advantage from the fourth dimension. Very good. Mach refuses to join company with the theologians and the spiritualists. Now, but how does he disassociate himself from them in his theory of knowledge? By stating that three-dimensional space alone is real. But what sort of defense is it against the theologians and their like when you deny objective reality to space and time? Why, it comes to this, that when you have to dissociate yourself from the spiritualists, you resort to tacit borrowings from the materialists. For the materialists, by recognizing the real world, the matter that we receive as an objective reality, have the right to conclude, therefrom, that no human concept, whatever its purpose, is valid if it goes beyond the bounds of time and space. But you Machian gentlemen deny the objective that validity of reality when you combat materialism, yet secretly introduce it again when you have to combat an idealism that is consistent, fearless, and frank throughout. If in the relative conception of time and space, there's nothing but relativity, if there is no objective reality, i.e., reality independent of man and mankind, reflected by these relative concepts, why should the majority of mankind not be entitled to conceive of beings outside of time and space? If Mach is entitled to seek atoms of electricity or atoms in general outside three-dimensional space, why should the majority of mankind not be entitled to seek the atoms or the foundations of morals outside three-dimensional space? There has never been an accoucheur who has helped a delivery by means of the fourth dimension. So, Lenin, is making fun of Mach, talking about um, male midwives or gynecologists or obstetricians. An excellent argument, but only for those who regard the criterion of practice as a confirmation of the objective truth and objective reality of our perceptual world. If our sensations give us an objectively true image of the external world existing independently of us, the argument based on accoucheur, on human practice generally, is valid. But if so, Machism as a philosophical trend is not valid. I hope, however, Mach continues, referring to his work of 1872, that no one will defend ghost stories. With the help of what I have said and written on the subject, one cannot hope that Napoleon did not die on May 5th, 1821. One cannot hope that Machism will not be used in the service of ghost stories when it has already served and continues to serve the immomentous, and not only the immomentous, as we shall see later. Philosophical idealism is nothing but a disguised and embellished ghost story. Look at the French and English representatives of imperial criticism, who are less flowery than the German representatives of this philosophical trend. Poincaré says that the concepts space and time are relative, and that it follows for non-materialists, it follows indeed that nature does not impose them upon us, but we impose them upon nature, or we find them convenient. Does this not justify the exaltation of Kantians? Does this not confirm Engels' statement that consistent philosophical doctrines must take either nature or human thought as primary? The views of the English Machist Karl Pearson are quite definite. He says, of time as of space, we cannot assert a real existence. It is not in things, but in our mode of perceiving them. Now, this is idealism, pure and simple. Like space, time appears to us as one of the plans on which that great sorting machine, the human perceptive faculty, arranges its material. Pearson's final conclusion, expounded as usual in clear and precise theses, is as follows. Space and time are not realities of the phenomenal world, but the modes under which we perceive things apart. They are not infinitely large nor infinitely divisible, but are essentially limited by the contents of our perception. This conscientious and scrupulous foe of materialism, with whom, we repeat, Mach frequently expresses his complete agreement, and who, in his turn, explicitly expressed his agreement with Mach, invents no special signboard for his philosophy, and without the least ambiguity names Hume and Kant as the classics from whom he derives his philosophical trend. And while in Russia there are few naive people, and while in Russia there are naive people who believe that Machism has provided a new solution for the problem of space and time, in English writings we find that scientists, on the one hand, and idealist philosophers on the other, at once took up a definite position in regard to Karl Pearson, the Machian. Here, for example, is the opinion of Lloyd Morgan, the biologist. And it's important to note the mention of Lloyd Morgan because this is a reference back through, stuff that Engels is interested in. Physics, as such, accepts the phenomenal world as external to, and for its purposes, independent of the mind of the investigator. He, Professor Pearson, is forced to a position which is largely idealistic. Physics as a science is wise, I take it, in dealing with space and time in frankly objective terms. And I think the biologist may still discuss the distribution of organisms in space and the geologists their distribution in time without pausing to remind their readers that after all, they're only dealing with sense impressions and stored sense impressions and certain forms of perception. All this may be true enough, but it is out of place, either in physics or biology. Lloyd Morgan is a representative of the kind of agnosticism that Engels calls shame-faced materialism. And however conciliatory the tendencies of such a philosophy are, nevertheless, it proved impossible to reconcile Pearson's views with science. With Pearson, the mind is first in space and then space in it, says another critic. There can be no doubt, remarked a defender of Pearson, R.J. Ryle, that the doctrine as to the nature of space and time, which is associated with the name of Kant, is the most important positive addition which has been made to the idealistic theory of human knowledge since the days of Bishop Berkeley. And it is one of the noteworthy features of the grammar of science that here, perhaps for the first time in writings of English men of science, we find at once a full recognition of the general truth of Kant's doctrine, a short but clear exposition of it. Thus we find that in England, the Machians themselves, their adversaries among the scientists and their adherents among the professional philosophers, have not even a shadow of a doubt as to the idealistic character of Mach's doctrine of time and space. Only some Russian writers, would-be Marxists, failed to notice it. Many of Engels' particular views, Bazarov, for example, writes in the Studies, as for example, his conception of pure time and space, are now obsolete. Indeed, the views of the materialist Engels are now obsolete, but the views of the idealist Pearson and the muddled idealist Mach are very modern. The most curious thing of all is that Bazarov does not even doubt that the view of space and time vis-a-vis the recognition or denial of their objective reality can be classed among particular views in contradistinction to the starting point of the world outlook spoken of by this author in his next sentence. Here you have an example of that eclectic pauper's broth of which Engels was wont to speak in reference to German philosophy of the 1880s. For to contrast the starting point of Marx's and Engels' materialist world outlook with their particular view of the objective reality of time and space is as utterly nonsensical as though you were to contrast the starting point of Marx's economic theory with his particular view of surplus value. To sever Engels' doctrine of the objective reality of time and space from his doctrine of the transformation of things in themselves into things for us, from his recognition of objective and absolute truth vis-a-vis the objective reality given us in our sensations, and from his recognition of objective law, causality, and necessity in nature, is to reduce an integral philosophy to an utter jumble. Like all the Machians, Bazarov erred in confounding the mutability of human conceptions of time and space, their exclusively relative character, with the immutability of the fact that man and nature exist only in time and space, and that beings outside time and space, as invented by the priests and maintained by the imagination of the ignorant and downtrodden mass of humanity, are disordered fantasies, the artifices of philosophical idealism, rotten products of a rotten social system. The teachings of science on the structure of matter, on the chemical composition of food, on the atom and the electron may and constantly do become obsolete. But the truth that man is unable to subsist on ideas and to beget children by platonic love alone never becomes obsolete. And a philosophy that denies the objective reality of time and space is as absurd and intrinsically rotten and false as is the denial of these latter truths. The artifices of the idealists and the agnostics are on the whole as hypocritical as the sermons on Platonic love of the Pharisees. In order to illustrate this distinction between the relativity of our concepts of time and space and the absolute opposition within the bounds of epistemology between the materialist and idealist lines on this question, I shall further quote a characteristic passage from a very old and very pure imperial criticist, namely the Humean Schutz Anaxidemus, who wrote in 1792, "If we infer things outside us from ideas and thoughts within us, then space and time are something real and actually existing outside us. For the existence of bodies can be conceived only in an existing space, and the existence of changes only in an existing time. Exactly. While firmly rejecting materialism and even the slightest concession to materialism, Schultz, the follower of Hume, described in 1792 the relation between the question of space and time and the question of objective reality outside us, just as the materialist Engels described it in 1894. The last preface to Anti-Düring is dated May 23rd, 1894. This does not mean that during these 100 years, our ideas of time and space have undergone no change, or that a vast amount of new material has not been gathered on the development of these ideas, material to which both Vorshilov-Chernov and Vorshilov-Valentinov refer as supposedly refuting Engels. This does mean that the relation between materialism and agnosticism as the fundamental lines in philosophy could not have changed, in spite of all the new names paraded by our Machians. And Bogdanov, too, contributes absolutely nothing but new names to the old philosophy of idealism and agnosticism when he repeats the arguments of Hering and Mach on the difference between physiological and geometrical space, or between perceptual and abstract space. He is fully repeating the mistake of Düring. It is one thing how, with the help of various sense organs, man perceives space, and how, in the course of a long historical development, abstract ideas of space are derived from these perceptions. It is an entirely different thing whether there is an objective reality independent of mankind which corresponds to these perceptions and conceptions of mankind. This latter question, although it is the only philosophical question Bogdanov did not notice beneath the mass of detailed investigations on the former question, and he was therefore unable clearly to distinguish between Engels' materialism and Mach's confusion. Time, like space, is a form of social coordination of the experiences of different people. Their objectivity lies in their general significance. This is absolutely false. Religion also has general significance as expressing the social coordination of the experience of the larger section of humanity, but there's no objective reality that corresponds to the teachings of religion. For example, on the past of the earth and the creation of the world, there is an objective reality that corresponds to the teaching of science, although it is as relative at every stage in the development of science as every stage in the development of religion is relative, that the earth existed prior to any society, prior to man, prior to organic matter, and that it has existed for a definite time and in a definite space in relation to the other planets. According to Bogdanov, various forms of space and time adapt themselves to man's experience and his perceptive faculty. Well, as a matter of fact, just the reverse is true. Our experience and our perception adapt themselves more and more to objective space and time and reflect them ever more correctly and profoundly. Now, I know that was a lot of yammering, perhaps on Lenin's part, and perhaps he was sort of bashing sort of prior beliefs, but attacks on positivism and idealism, and of course on the ideological failings of religion, etc., are part and parcel of the kind of important discussions that are necessary in a, whatever, if you want to call it, a revolutionary period for Lenin's writing. And it may be just a detour in our little continuing to talk about stuff, but I think it's important to refer to Lenin on time and space, partially because it is the kind of extension, and you might even call it an articulation. I'm not sure that that's even a good word, that, for example, Harvey's discussion of those things is a kind of important idea to keep in mind. That is, that there is a body of literature that is not purely phenomenological, but that does have material reality built into it, and the discussions of space and time with respect to Harvey's discussions of economic geography are actually kind of important. So I know that this has been a perhaps a bad detour, but there are some other writings that can relate to this and that I will yammer about likely tomorrow because I've run out of my time again as usual. a piece by and that I have yet to sort of get all the way through is H.T. Wilson's Space, Time, and Value. It's a chapter in a much larger text, Space, Time, and Value, Recovering the Public Sphere. Now, the point is, in all of these matters, it is a body of literature that is still important. It overlaps a variety of philosophical traditions. And yes, they are traditions by now. And that is, if you wanted to look, let's say, just as an example, and it is more philosophical than it is economic in some ways. Uh, the ideas that have to do with the formation of what counts as a social space or a set of social relations in space and time. And yes, there's French philosophy sort of involved, and it is of a nature that was not as well, sort of as forward, I suppose, or as prevalent, perhaps outside of France. But it's like Henri Lefebvre and a bunch of other folks, people who are of interest to people like David Harvey, etc. That space, time, and what I was yakking about before about the subtleties of the difference of value that is um, um, constant and variable and fixed and circular or circulating. Um, that subtle distinction, however subtle or obscure, that is actually necessary in not only Harvey's work, that is to talk about the issues of space and time in Capital, because ultimately it's going to come back to trying to reflect on the sort of central documents in that case, the reasons why we still read it, in other words, and even why. And I'm not going to over project on this, but I do think that Harvey's return to the Grundrisse is an example of this as well. So let me close with this little set of readings, and then I'll stop. Now, this is the abstract from H.G. Wilson's piece, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, I suppose. The author argues that capitalism's preference for exchange values over use values is reflected in the dominance of temporal concerns over spatial concerns in all Western countries. That's highly loaded there, of course. This is partly a function of equating time with paid labor and space with unpaid work. Conceptually, this preference is evident in the empirical credibility given to dichotomies that proceed from the seminal distinction between human beings and nature. These include mind, body, subject, object, ends, means, facts, values, policy, administration, and formulation, implementation dichotomies. While this list moves from the general to the more specific, it is only by effecting a practical critique based on public participation that a greater parity between space and time and use and exchange values will be realized. So there's something going on here. This idea of a practical critique is actually kind of important to talk of it in that way. This will require citizens to begin by challenging the dichotomies between formulation and implementation and policy and administration in the interests of dynamizing citizenship in and through policy implementation process. So all of these words, this verbiage is about praxis. And similarly, things that are written during the more vital times of Lenin's writings is this 10 questions to a lecturer, which essentially repeat the questions that Lenin was yammering about above in Space and Time, and his critique of Mach. What Lenin was trying to do, of course, is to address a variety of lines of thought that tended to privilege certain ideas that weren't fully dialectical. Let's just put it that way, and that he was trying to do this to try and challenge the kind of idealisms that were coming up in a variety of among Marxists. It's just it is the battle between idealisms and materialism. Um, and of course, if you're a rigid materialist or a more orthodox dialectical materialist, you will attack idealism in all of its forms, because otherwise you wind up talking about spiritualism or religion or something else. So this is a constant sort of political battle that, really doesn't have to be exercised, but I think you can see that this could be an important element to sort of work through stuff. So anyway, these 10 questions are kind of, as it were, study questions. And it is, does the lecturer confirm the fact that Marxism has nothing in common with Bolshevism, and that Lenin has repeatedly protested against Marxism, and that the Mensheviks, Yukevich and Valentinov, are pure empirical criticists? So that this is kind of a polemic, as it were, but I think the theoretical point, the one that affirms the existence of an objective reality that is a that is important to in doing science, or trying to make or argue for a Marxist science, is kind of important. So we end as we began, with certain issues about the existence of space and time, and that, as my initial point was being made, that if you compare constant and variable capital and fixed and circulating capital, you see that ultimately it does involve labor, but it also engages spatial and temporal issues, space and time issues, things that evolve over time, that are about transformation, that are explained in a variety of different kinds of ideas, dynamic ideas, ideas that will be referred to when we get to volume 2 on dynamic questions of turnover, etc., the Department 2 stuff. And to show that there is some evolution in Marx's own development about this, that we talked about the other day, that there is clearly a difference that, it's important to acknowledge in historical perspective, but not in terms of revising kind of where we are in the current moment. That there's a problem in making certain decisions about, or how to characterize Marxist thought, as though there were this moment where an epistemological break occurred. I don't think that that's really the case. It's just a kind of projection that people have made. But of course, to make that claim is to try to refute decades of Marxist thought. But I kind of tried to do that yesterday by invoking Steve Keen to suggest that at some moment we have to acknowledge the sort of foundational elements, but not determinative elements of Marxist labor theory of value, because it is a discussion of a certain degree of abstraction, a really important moment to distinguish between labor and labor power and its role in the larger sort of dialectical project that is to constantly oppose various things one against another, that is, exchange value, use value, concrete, abstract, commodity form, money, commodity form, money, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things are part of building a much bigger argument, and one needs to see that they're not purely sequential, but that they are important to see in their place, in their, in the difference between things that are relatively important, as opposed to the larger task, and that is to sort of integrate them into a reasonable critique, one that allows us to get sort of beyond what I think Lenin was doing, is a reasonable critique, but you could also say that he's simply being political, and that's another argument that could come from that. Okay, so I'm going to stop. I know that there are probably no trenchant questions. Um, yeah, I should have told you to spark one up for this. That's probably what we probably should have done. Let me um, shut this down. Let's see if, oh, I do have control of the live stream. I'm going to shut off the live stream before I say anything more.